our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, and welcome to this week's mini episode of Unspun. Do journalists need to try to be fair, and does being fair mean giving all sides of a story? That's what we'll talk about this week. People generally expect that the media is going to hear criticism of them, and one of the big criticisms we've heard recently is that media are doing a bad job because they either are not giving all sides of a story, or sometimes because they are giving all sides of a story. So what is going on there? I will say that when we teach students about how to be journalists, we do teach them the standards and practices of the fields, and in American journalism, and in a lot of European countries as well, we have what we call a non-bias norm. And so that means that you're just going to give the facts, right? You'll hear this in public comments sometimes, that, the news should just report the facts, or that we have a lying press or fake news who are just trying to promote a particular agenda in that case. And in 2022, the Pew Trusts actually did an interesting research study where they interviewed journalists and their audiences about their idea about this kind of thing. Does everybody have a right to be represented? Should every opinion be considered? And it turned out that the journalists and their audiences were really different in their views, with more than half of the journalists saying it was okay for journalists to maybe just give some parts of the opinion as other parts were not, true or valid. Whereas most of the audience, about 80%, said that journalists needed to give all sides. In some ways, you can also think this is maybe not possible. The New York Times, their slogan is all the news that's fit to print. That can't be true because they have a finite amount of paper that they're going to send to your house every week. So let's take a little bit of an in-depth look at the notion of what we'd call objectivity in journalism. I will tell you that it was genuinely surprising for me when I was kind of an adult and first started traveling on my own. And I would go and I'd look at newspapers in other countries, and they would seem horrendously biased. And I found out that not every place has that non-biased norm that we have here. But, in some places, you would actually have sort of the liberal side newspaper or the conservative side newspaper, and whichever one you wanted to get the news, that perspective, that's just the one that you would get. And that was just normal, and everybody expected that. But like I said, here we have that kind of non-bias or objective norm. So I was interested to find out where that came from. A scholar named Michael Schudson wrote a really good article about kind of the history of that idea going all the way back to early America, where printers tried to avoid controversy by staying neutral. They sort of printed by the good graces of whoever was the governing party at the time. But a lot of times the printers were writing commentary instead of writing objective reports of what happened. And in 1798, there was actually a Sedition Act that allowed the government to prosecute newspapers. So those people in power could actually prosecute newspapers for saying things that those people in power didn't like. But that was actually considered too extreme, and it expired after Jefferson was elected in 1800. The concept of objectivity, though, it really didn't exist then because the job of a journalist was pretty much different from the way that it is today. They weren't really seen as being expected to be neutral observers of what was going on. In the 19th century, editors really valued having speed and having, correct and accurate reporting, but they did still remain loyal to political parties. And you would find that in the sort of types of things that were covered. So only events were covered for the party that they supported. And if they covered speeches, sometimes they would maybe go in and report the words in a way that they weren't actually said to make the speaker sound better for the party that they supported. In Washington correspondents worked for the committees that they reported on. and they actually lived near the politicians from their own party. And the newspapers really continued to be very strongly partisan, even into there. As we kind of moved into the 20th century, we started seeing the rise of professional journalism. And reporters sort of developed their own culture with their own clubs, and they started developing their own particular practices that were special to journalism. And one of those practices was interviewing. And interviewing became popular as a way to sort of engage readers. So you weren't just trying to promote political agendas, but you were actually thinking about the audience. And this was because newspapers were growing into profitable businesses that had those larger audiences. The adoption of interviewing in the U.S. helped journalists here to become a really distinct professional group that had their own sort of standards and practices. And journalism became more and more organized, and reporters tried to, be really proud of the work that they did, be proud of being a member of this guild of journalism. And so that's kind of where the whole idea of objectivity came from, and this emerged in the 1920s. Really, since then, American journalists have embraced that objectivity standard, and they did it, more deeply, and they did it earlier than their European counterparts did. But we know that there's the traditional understanding of objectivity as being a neutral reporting or just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing. But it's actually controversial. A lot of people don't actually like it, and it's been critiqued in part by journalists themselves, because there is a sort of stream of thinking in journalism that says that the purpose of journalism is not just to write down what people say, but to actually solve problems in society. And so in order for journalism to be engaged, it can't be completely objective. And then there are academics who just reject the idea of neutral facts. And then finally, we have the digital effects on news, as most news is delivered digitally now. News has to interact with algorithms, and the algorithms are tending to go toward what people want. People have biases, and so that tends to favor non-objective things and kind of get rid of neutrality. Why does all this matter? We would value objectivity for a couple of reasons. The first is that if we have objective fact that everybody agrees on, then that means we all share that same set of facts, and that same set of facts that we share means that we have a shared view of reality, and that makes it a lot easier for us to talk to each other because we're all talking about the same thing. Second of all, I can never emphasize enough that media are businesses. And so as businesses, the saving of democracy is important to them, but the most important thing is making money for their shareholders. And I will tell my students, when I'm trying to convince them that they should be objective, that if you are not, anything you say that's sort of partisan, you're going to really turn off half of your potential audience. Everyone who doesn't agree with you is going to stop listening to you. And so if you're a business and you want to make as much money as possible, you need the largest audience that you can have, so you can't afford to be alienating them. So being objective is helpful in that as well. A third reason to value objectivity is power, and specifically thinking about how much power you want journalists to have in your society. We have a theory in communication called agenda setting, and that is telling people what they should think or what they should think about. And the theory is that the media does this by the issues that it kind of brings forward. I feel like that brings us to another really important point. I don't think of objectivity as being really possible. If you think about it, if you were just giving the facts, that would just be data. And data is definitely not what news is. What ways is the coverage of news leading to non-objectivity? There's several. First would be sort of what topic gets covered. So let's say that you work in the news and you hear about classrooms at a local school where the roof is leaking into the classrooms. Is that a story? You will literally sit in the newsroom and have a debate about whether that's a story, right? Someone will call up the education reporter and say that, and the education reporter will go to a news meeting and they'll be like, well, are we going to give up, our precious few minutes of time, our precious few inches of newsprint to cover that story? Because maybe it's just always been that way. Everybody knows that the roof is leaking, so how is that a story? It might be the way the conversation would play out. So lack of objectivity shows up in what topics get covered. Some topics are just assumed to be more important than others. The second is who actually gets asked about these things. And I'm going to talk about sourcing in a later episode, but I can tell you that you'd get a really different story if your major interview was with the state school superintendent, or if it was in a teacher with that classroom with a leaky roof. The state superintendent's going to be talking about school budgets and equity between districts and those kind of things. And the teacher in the classroom is going to be talking about how it's affecting what he or she does every single day. So that's two things. that don't work with objectivity. The third is sort of what those people get asked. So are they going to be asked about the politics of schools? Are you going to be running a human interest story? Those kind of things. And then another not very objective decision is where or when it gets run. So is that story about the leak at the school, is that like a 5 a.m. news where very few people watch it kind of thing? Or is it a 6 o'clock news, which is probably going to be your biggest one of the day? So you get the idea. Even a set of facts around a roof leaking into some classrooms at a school, it needs context. Selecting and providing that context is sort of by definition not objective. Now, another place where this comes up a lot is in neutrality and balance. For example, we've always covered both presidential candidates. What do you do if one of them tells a lot of lies? How about if that lying is very entertaining and attracts a large audience? Right? Those are real questions that we deal with in the media. Another concern is sort of making objectivity equated to sharing both sides. And I feel like this really came to the forefront in COVID. So you might have a story where you've got your health officials saying that masks help fight the spread of disease. And then you've got some people in your community who believe that if you wear a mask, your body doesn't get as much oxygen. Are you obligated to print those as both sides? One's probably true, one is probably not true. Are you obligated to print both sides of those? What if it turns out to be kind of a big deal in your community? What if there's a large anti-mask rally? The purpose of having those rallies, for me in the media is to get me to come down there and cover it. Right, it's to get that large public attention by creating this sort of spectacle. So if they do that, do I have to share their views about the masks and blood oxygen? What if it's a protest at a hospital? Can I cover that without sharing those harmful views? I can tell you from experience that if you share both sides, if you're neutral, you're kind of going to make both sides mad. People who think both sides of an issue are going to think you're wrong for showing the person they disagree with. Sometimes showing both sides, though, can just be downright harmful if someone's not being honest. So where do we go from here? I think the future of objectivity in journalism is pretty bleak. And I think that for a couple of reasons, but mostly because the economic model of journalism right now values engagement. It values getting eyeballs and clicks and those kind of things. And what attracts eyeballs and clicks and those kinds of things? It's that conflict news value. And it's partisanship, right? It's that kind of tribal, this is my side and I can fight against the other side. Those are the kinds of things that tend to really engage people. So the economic model is definitely pushing us away from objectivity. So before I go, let's do a little rewind and see if you can identify a logic issue we talked about in a previous episode's warm-up. Have a listen.
I will. Could I just ask one more question?
Redacted information about that.
Okay, drinking is one thing, but the concern is about truthfulness. And in your written testimony, you said sometimes you had too many drinks. Was there ever a time when you drank so much that you couldn't remember what happened or part of what happened the night before?
No, I remember what happened, and I think you've probably had beers, Senator, and so
you're saying there's never been a case where you drank so much that you didn't remember what happened the night before or part of what happened?
You're asking about, blackout. I don't know. Have you?
Could you answer the question, Judge? That's not happened. Is that your answer?
Yeah, and I'm curious if you have.
I have no drinking problem, Judge.
Yeah, nor do I.
Okay, thank you.
That is Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, back when he was having a confirmation hearing in front of the Senate. And the woman you hear is Senator Amy Klobuchar. Klobuchar is asking him a question about drinking, and Kavanaugh asks Klobuchar back a question that she's asking him. Do you ever drink so much that you don't remember what happened? This is an example of calling someone a hypocrite, right? That appeal to hypocrisy. And the speaker's going to hope that by doing that, by showing that whatever they did is common, that means it's not actually bad. And so, taken to an extreme, you wouldn't say, well, other people have been murdered, so the fact that I murdered someone is also fine. That's an extreme, and this is not that much of an extreme, but it is an example of that appeal to hypocrisy. All right, and so that'll wrap up this week's minisode of UnSpun. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for getting UnSpun with me this week. UnSpun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.